Their flames were burning. They were soon to conquer their world. They are not yet a nation, and no single ruler will command the troops. But for some time to come, they will call upon their pagan gods to give them strength and prosperity. Soon their voices will be heard in distant lands, and others will fear and admire, love and hate them. Stories will be told and retold over centuries, their sagas sending messages over millennia. When people see these ships coming, they will either be very impressed or very frightened. The dragon will fly across oceans.
I think they were at least down to New York. I think they were down to Florida, maybe into Mexico.
They will be known to the world as Vikings.
The Vikings have always had a bad press in European history, in part because they had a tendency to burn down the newspaper office by attacking monasteries and other centers of literacy, and this, of course, didn't get them a good write-up.
Their names forever etched into the history of places both near and far. Death and destruction. The trails of some Vikings end in a dark vault in Copenhagen, perhaps as a legacy of their violent past.
We have the remains of about 450 Norse Vikings from Greenland. At one of the early, probably one of the most early churchyards in North Greenland, there's a mass grave with 13 individuals, completely dismembered, bones completely jumbled up, with the skulls arranged nicely along one edge of the grave, and several of the skulls had very violent cut marks from either swords or axes.
Maybe the obvious signs of a violent life are only distracting us from the other and possibly more truthful story about a culture that rose above others and reigned for half a millennium. This was once a man who worked the land in distant Greenland. His remains, and those of other men, women, and children who settled on an Arctic coast, add a chapter to an astonishing story of survival and heroism. Every bone now reads like the chapter out of a book, giving scientists insight into daily life 1,000 years ago.
When we look at the skeletons, we can certainly see that nutrition, at least at the beginning of the settlement period, was okay. We don't see any overt signs of malnutrition.
It looks like the Vikings had a good life. But we also know that the growing population forced them abroad in search of new land, turning them from peaceful farmers to the rulers of the sea. The Vikings' sailor skills were outstanding, and they dominated the oceans for nearly half a millennium. Initially, the Vikings surfed along the coasts. As long as they could see land, navigation was easy. Once they set course over open sea, the rules changed. The Kronborg Castle in Denmark is most well known for being the home of Hamlet in Shakespeare's drama. What is less known is that the historical background to Hamlet is a well-known Viking time hero who lived in Denmark way before the castle was built. On the castle's premises, a modern-day Viking is trying to understand the naval skills of his ancestors. Søren Tirslund, a retired Danish sea captain, has many things in common with his ancestral Viking captains, and he is certain they knew how to navigate the oceans. A small wooden piece found during an excavation in Greenland could hold the key to the truth about Viking navigation. Søren Tirslund believes the piece originally looked like this, and that the sun at different times of the year would cast a shadow along the lines carved in the wood. The curved line fits the sun's movement during a day in the summer in Scandinavia.
The curve is relevant to the 60 degrees north latitude. We have been experimenting with it. We have run it on the computer, and they fit quite well with 60 or 61 north, which is the line you sailed from Scandinavia to Greenland.
There are those who do not believe Søren Tirslund can substantiate his claim about a Viking sun compass. Prepared to put his theory to the test, he asked for an analysis to be made by the Forensic Technical Department of the Danish police. Carl Hoberg took a close look at the wooden piece from Greenland. He was most interested in the lines carved in the wood. Were they accidental, or were they done for a purpose? He could see that the tip of a knife had carved at least twice in the same line. His conclusion is clear and simple.
My conclusion from the investigation is that the lines are purposely drawn, not lines randomly carved, as suggested by others.
The Viking captain would hold the sun compass horizontally, and as long as the shadow fell along the line, he knew that he was on a correct east-westerly course, and could then deduct the other directions as well. In Riem, a book from late Viking times, it is made absolutely clear that the Vikings had superb knowledge of astronomical navigation. For example, they knew and used the knowledge of a spherical world. They knew about the moon and tidal currents, and they could calculate the time for ebb and flow for any place on Earth. And the quadrant is described, which made it possible for them to measure the height of the sun, make tables for its declination day by day during the year, and use the polar star for navigation. The stroke of the oars was their clock, and measuring the distance they rowed in a few strokes, as observed by passing a floating object, allowed them to calculate distance over time. Based on all this knowledge, they laid down distance charts for most European sailing routes, even in the Mediterranean. Comparing their numbers to modern satellite navigation, we can conclude that the Vikings' estimates of distance were off by less than 2 to 4%, even on long distances, like across the Atlantic. The information in Riem clearly shows that the Viking culture did not develop in isolation in Scandinavia. During hundreds of years prior to this time, knowledge had survived and spread from people like the Greek geographer Ptolemaeus, active in the 2nd century AD, or reached the Vikings from the distant court of the Caliph of Baghdad. But the experienced mariner would also use other signs for navigation. He knew that whales would appear when approaching Iceland, and that seabirds in the air indicated he was fairly close to land. Following the flying birds would bring him ashore. In the early 8th century, Irish monks seeking voluntary exile for service to God drifted ashore on the remote island of Iceland. Stories telling of their arrival must have reached the Vikings in Norway and prompted the first wave of emigration to the new land. The landscape they met in Iceland was like nothing they had seen back home in Scandinavia. The Vikings of the North Atlantic were known as the Norse. Middle-ranking chieftains who were outmaneuvered by others as the kingdoms of Scandinavia slowly formed saw their chance to rule by finding a new land.
I think that it's useful to distinguish between the mindset of the chieftains who are going out mainly to find some place where they could be chieftain. Almost all of them had lost power struggles someplace further east, either in Norway going to Iceland, or in Iceland then going to Greenland. I think for the other people who are going with the chieftains, basically they were looking for land, they were looking for a better life, they were looking for some place where they could be more prosperous farmers.
They brought their extended families, slaves, and their animals to Iceland. A whole farming community relocated. Many early settlers were of mixed Norse-Celtic marriages. In many ways, the situation underscores the fact that to be a Viking was a lifestyle rather than the proof of a pure Scandinavian heritage. And some of the oldest houses excavated in Iceland bear all the signs of houses normally found in Eastern Europe.
Then the conclusion could be that there were some Slavs who came to Iceland. Maybe there were slaves, but then you would not allow your slave to build a house like he wanted. So probably they were free settlers. And then we find these houses as the first houses in the places that were occupied by the early settlers.
This is a radically new theory of the origin of the early settlers. To be among the first to settle was advantageous, since another part of the Viking settlement strategy was that people arriving later were forced to rent their animals from the pioneers, who in turn grew richer and politically stronger. Anthropologist Tom McGovern at Hunter College in New York has sifted through the remains of early settlements in Iceland.
It's easy to see the Viking colonizers in the North Atlantic coming in and essentially infecting these virgin lands with European insects in themselves and destroying the ecosystem. It's quite clear that when the Vikings moved out across the North Atlantic, they carried with them a set of ideas in their head about what they wanted in terms of an ideal farm. It certainly included pigs, cows, sheep, goats, horses, the whole mix that they had grown up with for thousands of years back in Europe. As they introduced this package into the North Atlantic, it had impacts. It caused deforestation, it caused the loss in many cases of grass and opening up of erosion.
The herds quickly multiplied, gaining prosperity for some early settlers. And for most of them, this was most likely a profound change from the life they had lived in Scandinavia. Archaeologists have found few remains to indicate the early settlers were rich and famous. It looks like the people arriving in Iceland were from lower social classes, people who sought a chance to get land of their own and a political position in a new land. Back home, they would have remained without social and political influence. In their new land, they could use their traditional farming methods and the food they were accustomed to from their native homelands. But their activities would forever change the Icelandic landscape. Not even the Viking times were spared the human greed causing ecological devastation. So, as archaeologist Orri Vestensson walks, himself a modern-day descendant of the Vikings, he sees a landscape much different from the one seen by the early settlers.
So when the Norse came here in the late 9th century, most of the country, at least the lowland parts, would have been covered with woodlands like these. The difference would have been that the woodlands were much more dense and the trees thicker and higher. And 50 years later, the forest has completely disappeared from this landscape. We don't know exactly how they did it, but we assume they cut it down in parts, but we also know that in places they just burnt the forest away. And we sometimes find burning horizons in the soils associated with early settlement. And that certainly suggests that they were just trying to get rid of the forest. It was in their way. They just wanted open pasture lands, and this is what we got.
But the Vikings that arrived in Iceland also brought Christianity to the island. And by exercising their rights, the church grew powerful and rich. This place has been occupied by churches for more than 1,000 years. However, Orri Vestensson is surprised that they have generally found so few signs of wealth in Iceland, far less than what has been found in Scandinavia.
And the conclusion from this is simply that the people who came here probably didn't have very many options back home, that they were from the lower layers of Norse society in Norway or Denmark, wherever they came from, and that they were trying to build a new life for them here in this new country.
It was still a tough life in Iceland, on the threshold between the old pagan religions and the promises made by Christianity. Some would not give up the heathen traditions, such as eating horse meat, committing infanticide, or sticking to pagan burial traditions. The Icelandic sagas are written accounts which give us good insight into the daily lives of people during Viking times. The original text can easily be read, even today. The texts tell us about the problems facing the people of Iceland. For latecomers, it was difficult to gain access to fertile land, and many of them probably thought about moving on to new virgin territories. The remote colony had a choice, but had no timber available for houses and ocean-going vessels. A trade pact with Norway, which hinged on the Norwegians' demand that the land adhere to Christendom, was inevitable. But on the Icelandic farms, stories were told of distant lands sighted by brave seafarers. For many young Norse, the stories and sagas created dreams of a different life. However, they also described the dangers of going further west.
Bjarni then spoke, "Our journey will be thought an ill-considered one, since none of us sailed the Greenland Sea." Despite this, they set sail, and sailed for 3 days until the land has disappeared under the horizon. They were beset by winds from the north and fog. For many days they didn't know where they were sailing.
Eric the Red, a low-ranking chieftain, fled west after slaying a man in Iceland. His was the first attempt to settle a new land further west. After rough times in the pack ice, they were rewarded by a beautiful sight. In the years to come, Eric the Red, now the highest-ranking ruler of a new land, sold his concept of a green land to followers, creating an exodus out of an Iceland torn asunder by religious and political conflict. But the first convoy to sail to Greenland was hit hard. Of the 25 ships leaving Iceland, only 14 made it to Eric the Red's settlement. It was a green land, but the glaciers were never far away. Only a narrow stretch of land along the coast was free of ice, but wide enough to create the new land Eric had promised his followers. His promise of a green land was not a lie. 1,000 years ago, the climate was much warmer than it is today, and in sheltered fjords, the forests grew tall. When the first settlers arrived, fairly dense and tall forests covered large areas deep in the fjords. It was a good land, and Eric was certain the move to Greenland was the right one. The grazing was good, and the farmers could use the land in a fashion they were used to in Iceland or Norway. Soon, some 3,000 people occupied hundreds of new farmsteads along the southwest coast of Greenland. They soon felt at home. They lived here, surrounded by one of the richest oceans on Earth and with lakes and streams teeming with fish. Salmon and Arctic char were so plentiful that the settlers could probably fish them by hand at times. But it looks like the farmers had no intention of becoming fishermen.
I think one of the most surprising things about looking at bones in Iceland and Greenland is the lack of fish in Greenland. When I started out as a graduate student, I was sure the old guys had missed the fish. People working after me are sure that I missed the fish too. And we've all gone out, we've all sieved, we've all looked really carefully, and none of us have found them. It's a strange thing. Why aren't they eating more fish in Greenland? None of us knows the answer.
No, the Vikings continued agricultural practices that they were used to. They were not yet ready for a change in lifestyle. This decision was possibly the first step to their own demise. Christianity quickly spread through Scandinavia from the early 9th century. Not that the Vikings gave up their age-old pagan traditions, but they accepted Christianity and built churches as long as the new system could prove to be of value to them. But in some of the churches, still standing from Viking times, the art clearly shows a mixture of the religious traditions, very much like it can be seen on the runestones. Eric the Red in Greenland was one of the chieftains who opposed Christianity. But he was married to a very strong woman who demanded he build her a church and that he should convert to the new religion. At the end of the day, Eric could not resist the pressure. Her love was denied him unless he complied with her demands. From that day on, the Greenland settlement was a Christian settlement.
We know from written sources, especially from Icelandic sagas, that the people who came up here were Christians from a very early period, or perhaps they were even Christians when they arrived up here.
Most likely, every chieftain in Greenland built a church on his land. Inside the wall, the earth was consecrated and could be used for burials. Thus, the chieftains used Christianity to become even more powerful. And the word soon spread to the Pope. The Vatican wanted to have their share of the wealth produced in a faraway land, and soon all people in Greenland had to pay tithes to the church.
In Greenland, as in Iceland, we had what we call a privately owned church system. That means that the churches were owned by the chieftains or the large farmer. And of course, the farmer was the one who got the income from the church. So if others wanted to use this church for burials, for instance, they had to pay for the use of the church.
The contact was established to the Pope, to Rome. Many things were sought after, such as narwhal teeth, walrus teeth, and walrus hides that were very strong, all important trade goods that the church had asked the local inhabitants to use as payments to the Pope. And for this reason, we can believe that the Norse made expeditions far to the north to collect these items. And it would be very strange if they, on occasion, had not met the Inuit people.
Og det ville være mærkeligt, hvis det ikke har mødt nogen grønlændere undervejs, hist og her.
It took a lot of courage to sail the Viking ships into the icy waters of the Arctic. But the wealth to be found was worth the risk. Seals such as the walrus were not yet very used to people and became easy prey to Norse sailors who developed the skill to hunt in the pack ice. But the Norse were not alone among the ice floes. The Inuit and Norse arrived in Greenland about the same time. The Inuit arrived from the north, crossing over from Arctic Canada. Their meeting was probably a surprise to them both, and even though there were stories of hostilities, the encounter was probably friendly. Unlike the Norse, the Inuit already knew which Arctic resources were there: rope made out of sealskin, ivory from walrus tusks, and fur from seals and polar bear. The ivory and rope in particular became highly prized trading goods that made the Greenland colony flourish and made European traders willing to maintain regular contacts. If and when the ships reached the southernmost tip of Greenland, they could find shelter away from the pack ice. Today, a group of Danish archaeologists are trying to paint a picture of Herjolfsnes, the community that grew here. They do not find a lot of remains, but one unearthed discovery is especially interesting.
What we believe to have found here is a Norse boathouse. It is a ship-shaped building, no wall towards the sea, so we believe it's a house that they have pulled up their boats maybe during the winter so that they had shelter for storms and things like that. And we believe this to be one of many Norse boathouses in Greenland, so this is just the start of a bigger project.
Maybe this is also the shipyard, the wharf, where battered ships could be repaired before attempting ongoing journeys further west. For the Vikings, this was a new world, and they had yet to learn how to make the most of it. Even though the Vikings were skilled mariners, navigating the treacherous icy waters was always a dangerous task. Bjarni, a daring young Norse, once lost his way at sea and drifted in fog to a land he didn't know, but he was sure it wasn't the Greenland he had heard of. His story of an unnamed land sparked the interest of other Norse sailors. One of them was Eric the Red's son, Leif Erikson. The currents and wind patterns close to Greenland favor a trip to North America. Riding the currents, a ship would slowly approach Baffin Island. But these waters are some of the most dangerous in the world, often filled with icebergs and underwater growlers that would easily destroy a Viking ship upon contact. When the winds and currents were extremely helpful, the trip across to North America could be made in days. But when the weather turned foul and winds brewed to storm force, or when icebergs were creating impenetrable walls, ships could be stuck for weeks without reaching land on either side. But Leif, also called Leif the Lucky, made it across and found the new land. He called this barren land Heljuland, meaning slab land, because of its stony appearance. They sailed on. To the south they encountered forests, and the further south they went, the taller the trees. He called the place Markland, the land of trees. Encouraged by what they saw, they continued.
They spent 2 days at sea with northeasterly winds before they saw land. They sailed towards it and came to an island. In the fine weather they found dew on the grass that they collected in their hands and drank, and thought they had never tasted anything as sweet.
Archaeologist Birgitte Wallace has followed in Leif Erikson's footsteps, finding the remains of his and other Norse expeditions to North America. She knows the Vikings called their newfound land Vinland, the land of wine, and she is convinced that the name reflects the discoveries they made.
Looking for Vinland, I think I really like to turn the map upside down and remember we are coming from Greenland. And here is Lonesome Meadows in northern Newfoundland, where I worked. And I think Vinland is this, all the coast around the Gulf of St. Lawrence.
The only remains of a Norse settlement found in North America, at present-day Lanza Meadows, is most likely Leif Erikson's original camp. The archaeologist's groundwork allows us to reconstruct the place. The houses are situated along the coast, so it would be easy to find them when sailing here. And from this point, the Vikings could make excursions to other areas for hunting, collecting of wild wine grapes, and other valuable resources, as described in the sagas. The layout of the houses also differs from normal settlements in Greenland and Scandinavia. The floor space for storage is abnormally large. This is an indication that the site was a place where goods were collected and stored.
It seemed to them the land was good, that the livestock would need no fodder during the winter. Leif named the land for its natural features and called it Vinland.
There has been a long debate over the accuracy of the saga's accounts. The stories were written down more than 200 years after the original events took place, but enough can be verified through archaeology to allow for a number of conclusions.
The men dominated, but some women were along to do what was normal female chores, such as cleaning, cooking, maintenance of clothing.
We can also guess that the exploration team consisted of a strong leader, skilled craftsmen, and a number of slaves. The sagas also tell that the trips were exploratory, but that if they found the right place, they would settle and establish a colony there. From the sagas, we also know that the first and possibly only European to be born on the new continent during this period was Snorri, the son of Gudrid the Beautiful. A lot of artifacts found at the Norse site indicate that boats were repaired there. They had arrived in their large vessels, but had smaller dinghies in tow. We know that the blacksmith was busy making new rivets to replace corroded ones and to attach new planks to hulls. Close to the boat repair site, archaeologists found lumps of corroded iron. Using X-ray photography, revealed the old rivets inside. But one of the most striking results from excavations is the neutron analysis of jasper stone used for making fire. Analysis shows that the stones in the largest building came from Greenland, and in other houses, the stones originated in Iceland. This fits perfectly with the sagas telling us about Leif Erikson coming from Greenland and his companions from Iceland. For the Norse, the abundant supplies, not in the least timber for ship and house building, must have made them think this place was heaven. Butternuts found at the site indicate that the explorers had been to the inner parts of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, which was the nearest place to find these nuts. And the wild grapes, which produced the much sought-after wine, came from warmer climes. From the tip of Newfoundland, the Norse must have launched journeys to other sites.
It's not very likely that so ambitious people as they were would have been content to stay at a very cold place in Newfoundland or in the northern places where they had sea ice half of the year. They would have known that it would be much warmer and better further south.
Icelandic writer Paul Berg-Torsen's theories have sparked a debate, especially his claim that the Norse sailed to present-day New York. None of this has been substantiated in archaeological discoveries.
We know there was an important Norse settlement in northern Newfoundland. And I have a very hard time to see that they would continue all the way south to New York. Already in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, you get the most wonderful resources to a Norseman. Why would anybody bother to go further?
Sailing along Newfoundland and Nova Scotia's coasts is tough work, even today. A millennium after Leif Erikson's original voyage, Gunnar Marel Egertsen decided to sail the same distance from Iceland to Greenland and to North America. Smaller replica ships joined him along the Newfoundland coast to commemorate the Vikings' original journey. But only the bigger boats could have sailed farther. And as a sailor, Gunnar is convinced he knows the mindset of Leif Erikson and his followers. Their thinking was no different than his own today.
We are always trying to get further and further. That's in the nature of man. For a Viking on a Viking ship to sail to Lanzometos, Newfoundland, and stop there would be a really stupid thing to do. I think they were at least down to New York. I think they were down to Florida, maybe into Mexico.
Sailing into New York Harbor, Gunnar is certain the sagas have accurately described this as one of the places the Norse traveled to. Paul Bergtorsen is of the same opinion.
The harbor of New York is, I think, what they called Hope, which means sea lagoon, actually, which it is. And they told about a river flowing from the north, that's the Hudson River. And this, of course, would have been very tempting as a good harbor for them.
Karlsefni and his company sailed into the lagoon and called the land Hope. There they found fields of self-sown wheat and vines growing on the hills. They dug trenches along the high water mark, and when the tide ebbed, there were holy fish in them.
Paul Bergtorsen's conclusion is that the settlement of Hopp could have been situated at present-day Brooklyn, and that the fish they found was the winter flounder. The sagas also tell about the Norse meeting with the Aboriginal people. The Norse talked in derogatory terms about the natives, calling them Skrælings.
One of the passages in the sagas which is hard to understand initially was why the Skrælings, the Native Americans, went from happily trading with the Norse one day, accepting strips of red cloth and buckets full of milk for furs, and then the next day they come back angry and they don't even talk, they just start fighting. And of course today we know what happened. The Skrælings went home and drank the milk. Coming from a hunting and gathering population, they were lactose intolerant. Most of them couldn't digest the milk and reacted to it as though they'd been poisoned. And I'm sure they assumed that they were and came back looking for revenge the day after. So I think that milk is certainly part of the reason why Skræling and Norsemen got along badly in North America.
But the value created by the trade probably kept the Vikings in the area, in spite of the disastrous meetings with the natives. The fact that milk would become the most powerful weapon in the Vikings' arsenal is a surprising revelation about a people famed for their violent acts. There would be no peaceful coexistence with the Native Americans. The Norse had no superior weapons and knew that they were losing the battle.
It's very easy to tell from the sagas that the Norse were fearful of the Aboriginal people already in North America, and why shouldn't they be? I mean, they were outnumbered by the thousands.
Karlsefni and his men had realized by now that although the land was excellent, they could never live there in safety or freedom from fear because of the native inhabitants. So they made ready to leave the place and return home.
But perhaps the attempt to settle a new land was ill-fated from the beginning.
You can't start a new settlement with just a couple of handful of people. You need hundreds, and they didn't have hundreds to spare.
The attempt to stay in North America went on for possibly as much as 40 years, and even though the sagas only mention 5 different trips, we have reasons to believe that many more ships sailed along these coasts. On returning to Greenland, these people soon faced a new problem. The climate had turned for the worse, and farming became increasingly difficult. The climate theory to explain the Norse demise in Greenland has been the accepted fact for a long time, but scientists are starting to challenge this theory. Danish scientist Nadja Mikkelsen is looking for new evidence.
There are many theories why the Norse disappeared from Greenland. One of them is that they actually caused heavy erosion in the area by overgrazing and by cultivating the landscape, making grass for their livestock and cattle. And what we want to do is we want to see whether we can prove that theory or disprove it by finding heavy sand deposits and soil erosion in this area.
If erosion is a factor, Nadja means that the fjord outside some of the more densely populated Viking settlements would tell the story. Sending equipment to the seabed to investigate the situation gave the scientists their first clues. For the scientists, it is very important to be able to differentiate between the effects caused by natural phenomena, such as the eroding activities of the glaciers, and human-induced erosion. In layer upon layer, the sediments in the fjord tell Nadja and her colleagues about the outflow of sediments from the surrounding farmland. The Norse were good farmers. During the summer, people and animals would move up to the higher elevations for grazing, allowing for hay, for the winter feeding, to grow on the better pastures in the valleys. But did the grazing still exceed the ecological limits when the climate changed? Nadja hasn't found the sand deposits she's looking for.
So this seems to indicate that it wasn't the Norse who actually caused any soil erosion, and that the decline of the Norse culture here in Greenland wasn't caused by them overgrazing and destroying the landscape.
1,000 years later, the old Viking farms are in use again. But today it's the Inuit people who have taken up the job of farming, and the land they use today was cleared and cultivated by the Norse. And the young people of Greenland, most of them of Inuit ancestry, are interested in finding out more about the history of their own land. After all, as the Aboriginal people of Greenland, they share their history in part with the Norse. And one often debated aspect of the relationship between the Norse and Inuit is whether there was hostility between them, possibly forcing the Norse to give up this land, just as they had had to give up their settlement in North America. Searching for evidence at an Old Norse farm, the students add new information about the daily life of the Norse in Greenland. Every bone found close to the old houses has a story to tell, and it brings the Norse culture and modern-day Inuit culture closer together. Slowly, the story of the final days of the Norse in Greenland comes alive.
We see evidence that the bone has been really smashed up and very finely, and it looks as though they've gone to the trouble of making this bone soup, of extracting the last bit of good from the bones. We have in several sites in the western settlement area dog bones cut, sometimes gnawed, on the uppermost floor layers of the houses. Norse people in Iceland, Greenland, and elsewhere didn't normally eat their dogs, but it looks as though in the final days in these settlements that may very well have happened. So we do have evidence for something really bad happening in the western settlement at the end.
Starvation took its toll. More bodies ended up in the Greenland churchyards, and the people who died far away in Vinland, North America, were also brought back home to Greenland for burial. As Christians, they had to be buried in consecrated earth.
I'm now walking on one of those sites which we think could be a church. On my left hand you have the fence around the churchyard, and on my right the ruin. But to be sure that it actually is a church, we have to excavate. So what do you think of? Is you finding anything? As soon as we have found a grave with a skeleton in, we know that people have been buried here, and we are sure that we have found a church.
Back in Copenhagen, archaeologist Jette Arneborg has teamed up with medical doctor Niels Linderup at the Panum Institute, hoping that his analyses can shed light on the Norsemen's final days in Greenland. Using tooth enamel for analyses provides some of the answers.
The oxygen isotope readings from the teeth made it clear that this climate change, which we knew from ice core borings, also directly affected the humans living up there.
The bones also show signs of more infections and the possibility that people got shorter, perhaps as a result of malnutrition.
Which could indicate that indeed living conditions deteriorate somewhat over the 400-500 years of living in Greenland.
Niels Linderup's bone analyses have shaped a picture of a people that had to change their diet. Different oxygen isotopes in the bones can shed light on the food's origin.
What we're seeing is a change probably from a very land-based economy. They had cattle, goats, sheep, animal husbandry, farmers, if you will, changing gradually to a diet which contains more and more marine food, fish, seal, and so on.
It is really strange that the Norse didn't make use of the marine resources that were so plentiful around them much earlier during their colonization.
Throughout the North Atlantic, seals like this fellow were poor man's food, although in Greenland, almost everybody certainly ate seal meat at some times. One thing we find in Greenland is, as time passes, more and more seal bones wind up in the middens inland in higher elevations, in the smaller farms. In fact, strangely enough, we find more seal bones in these small, high elevation farms, miles and miles from the nearest salt water, than we find on larger farms with the better pastures and the more cow bones that are right down by the water.
Strangely enough, it looks like the Vikings did not realize they were doomed, in spite of the fact that an alternative lifestyle was available to them.
Well, why didn't they go native? Why didn't they become as the Eskimo? And if they did that, maybe they would have still been up there. But I don't think that was never contemplated. They had their culture, and inside certain boundaries, they were willing to change. They were willing to change their diet to a certain extent. But beyond that, I would say that probably life just wasn't worth living up there for the Norse.
But no doubt the climate became colder and the fjords were blocked by more ice. The residents couldn't bring timber in from Labrador or Norway, and maintaining their ships was very difficult.
What did happen was the Icelanders and the Greenlanders become increasingly isolated, increasingly dependent upon other people's ships to come to them. And it's sort of a terrible irony. These two initially great seafaring peoples wind up being effectively landlocked by their lack of seagoing ships.
As the Scandinavian kingdoms formed in the 11th and 12th centuries, the Viking Age came to an end in Europe. But the Norse in Greenland continued to flourish for another 200 years, as they had done for almost half a millennium. And then suddenly, they were gone. Only ruins remained in Greenland, not a single Norseman.
I don't think we need a catastrophe to explain why the Norse disappeared. With lower population numbers, a slow and orderly emigration over 100 to 200 years could explain why the Norse settlements were abandoned.
The Vikings and the Norse remained Europeans to the bitter end, not opting to live like the Inuit people and survive in an Arctic land. For many of them, the final Viking voyage was back to Iceland, Scandinavia, or other European sites where they would be comfortable and feel at home. The slender longship and the efficient cargo vessels disappeared from the oceans. But the Vikings had forever made their mark on European history, on shipbuilding, maritime navigation, and naval language. The dragon had folded its wings, but history will always remember the people who became the rulers of the sea.